Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Spinagle from the Warning Decision Training Division. Along with me is Jill Hardy, also from WDTD. I'd like to welcome you to our 7th installment of our Revival of the Storm of the Month series. Today's presentation comes to you from the Radar Operations Center in Norman, Oklahoma. Our presenter is Clark Payne, who will be presenting VCP and RPS List best practices. And with all that being said, Clark, the floor is yours, so go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to everybody at WDTD for giving me this opportunity. I want to just start off real quick. We've got a lot to cover, so I'll try to go as fast as possible. I've been given 22 minutes. But the one thing I really want to say here is that a lot of what I'll talk about today are just recommendations that come from the ROC. Obviously, local needs vary, and you can modify that slightly to make things work best for you. So let's get started. First thing we'll start off with is a history of the VCPs. When the 88D first came out, there were only 4 VCPs. There was 31, 32 for clear air, and 11 and 21 for preset mode. And then RPG Build 5 in the early 2000s came out, and there was 12 and 121 that became available. And that allowed for faster updates with 12, and you actually got better de-aliasing with 121. Then in RPG Build 9, the SE2 range unfolding algorithm was implemented, and you got 211, 212, and 221, and that basically just helped mitigate range folding in the products. And then in RPG Build 18, after Build 9, you can see there were 9 VCPs available, and 18 decided to kind of help consolidate those down, and we actually got rid of 11, 21, 211, and 221, and combined all those into VCP 215. And what was nice about 215 is it has the common elevation angles with 12 and 212. And then there's also a new clear VCP that came out, and it also had same elevations as 215, 12, and 212. So if you were going between the two, you were kind of sampling the same space, and that was the idea behind that. And then with RPG Build 19, which should be coming out later this year, we are getting rid of 121 and replacing it with 112, and this is the new MPDA, so there's been improvements made to it. And again, it'll have common elevation angles as with 215, 12, 212, and 35. So you're kind of seeing that common theme there of common elevation angles, which is great. All right, so moving on. Now we're going to just talk about some quick strengths of each of the VCPs. I'm just going to highlight some of them. I'm not going to go into detail too much. But here with VCP 35, this is good for most clear situations or light precipitation events. It does scan a little bit higher than 31 and 32, so that's nice. It also has sales ×1 available, so you can get low-level updates on the order of 3.5 to 4 minutes, which if you're trying to track some clear air boundaries, that may be very beneficial for you. It still has good data quality because you're still scanning at a fairly slow rate because it's taking upwards of 7 or 8 minutes to complete. The only drawback here is that there is no MRLE available, and we'll get into those here in just a second too. 31 and 32, again, these are also good for light precip events and picking up clear air boundaries. However, they do take around 10 minutes to complete. VCP 31 is the long pulse version, so you get a little better sensitivity. Both have the best data quality of the clear VCPs. However, there is no sales or MRLE available with 31 or 32. Okay, now we're going to switch over to the preset VCPs. We'll start off with 215. This one's great for general non-severe precip events and also for pre-storm surveillance. Mainly that's because it scans the higher elevations with more elevation scans. But the other ones, you have a little more gap there in the upper elevation. So if you're trying to capture some stuff that's happening high aloft first, this one might be a great VCP to start in. Also, you do have sales ×1 and you have MRLE ×4 available in VCP 215. Going to 12 and 212, this is great for severe storms, especially if you have the need for rapid low-level updates. You can use sales ×3 or MRLE ×4 to help kind of rescan those lower elevations more often so that you can track what's happening there at the lowest levels. Also, this volume scan typically completes in about 5 minutes. So if you're running sales or MRLE, that can kind of bump that time up just a little bit, but still you're completing pretty quickly with VCP 12 and 212. And then the last one here that we'll talk about is VCP 112. It is great for widespread severe storms with high winds, such as hurricanes and derechos. And you do have sales times 1 available with it. However, you do not get MRLE. And what's great about this VCP is it really mitigates the range folding the best of any of the VCPs. So if you're having issues with widespread range folding, this could be a great one to utilize. Now that's if you're manually selecting VCPs. There is an automated way of choosing VCPs, but it only goes between a default precip and a default clear VCP, and that's done via the mode selection function. And like I said, what it does is it allows for the RPG to automatically switch between default clear and default precip VCPs based on the hybrid scan reflectivity coverage. And the default parameters to switch between that is if you have an area of 30 dBz greater than 80 square kilometers, it'll go from clear air into precip mode. However, these are adaptable, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. If you go into the VCP and mode control window, the clear switching or the mode automation is done here in this section in the upper right of that window. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the settings here a little bit. If you want to know more about that, go into the guidance on adaptable parameters on the ROC web page. It goes into a lot more detail in how each of these settings work, but we'll just touch on these real briefly. It's ideal to leave both clear air and precip switches in auto. If you are having issues with it toggling between precip and clear air, it's best to go in and try to adjust those adaptable parameters before going into manual, just because with manual, you might set it and forget it and then go, oh yeah, I forgot to do that. So manual switching is good, but only for temporary uses. You may be in the middle of an event and say, hey, it keeps toggling back over to something, and hey, I just want to leave it in this until after the event, and then you can go in and kind of jump around and mess with those parameters. All right, and then I said that does a default clear and default precip VCP, and that's what we see here just below the mode automation section of the VCP and mode control window. It allows the user to select the defaults used when the MSF is in control. And for precip mode, the ROC recommends using VCP 215, and for clear air, it recommends VCP 35. And mainly, these are recommended because they're the most versatile of the precip and clear VCPs, and they're generally good for most situations outside of maybe like a heavy snow or a severe storm event, which then you'd want to go into one of the 212 or maybe even 31 if it's a snow or something like that. But those are the most versatile there. All right, now we'll talk about modifying your VCP. So now you've chosen it, or it's chosen for you, and then you can go in here. The first thing is AVSET. It stands for Automated Volume Scan Evaluation and Termination. And what it basically does is it'll terminate the volume scan early when minimal echoes are present aloft. This can significantly speed up scan times if storms are far away and you're not really needing to scan up in higher elevations. The next thing we'll talk about is SAILS. It stands for Supplemental Adaptive Intravolume Low-Level Scan. And what it does, it allows you to repeat the lowest elevation scan up to 3 times. What you can see here from the window is that for SAILS ×1, there's 5 VCPs that allow that, but for 2 and 3, only 212 and 12 allows multiple SAILS cuts. So just keep that in mind. If you're wanting multiple, you'll need to go into one of those 2 VCPs. And then also, it is disabled by default. That's because the ROC really recommends that if you switch into SAILS, that you do it as a conscious decision, that you're really going, okay, yep, I want to make sure that I rescan those low elevations. So it's disabled by default. And then looking at MRLE here, it's very similar to SAILS. It stands for the mid-volume rescan of low-level elevations. And what it does is it repeats the lowest 2 to 4 elevations once in the middle of a volume scan. And you can see that's only available in 212, 215, and VCP 12. It is also disabled by default, and it is also recommended by the ROC to be a conscious decision when wanting to turn it on. All right, a couple notes on the MRLE and sales settings is the last setting applied for MRLE and sales will be remembered by the RPG. So we recommend that after an event, if you've used sales or MRLE, to go ahead and disable it, because if you go back into a clear air VCP and then switch back into 12 or 212 and you had sales times 3, it'll go right back into sales times 3. So maybe you didn't want that when you go back into it. So we recommend disabling after an event. There is a bug currently in the RPG for supplemental low elevation sites, so sites that scan lower than 0.5 degrees. No MRLE times 4 is available. It's not available in 215, but with build 19, you will get that capability. And then sales and MRLE will be also utilized in the QPE calculations with build 19. However, it will not be included in the PPS or the legacy precip estimates. All right, and then for supplemental low elevation sites, you will now see this base tilt option in your VCP and mode control window. And what it basically does, it allows those sites to be able to disable scanning at that supplemental low elevation angle. Maybe you're getting too much clutter or something like that, and you just want to disable it for a while. You will be having the option to do that in build 19. The default is to enable it, so it will be there when you first start up in build 19. And then one thing to realize is that sales and MRLE will utilize that supplemental low elevation angle. So if you have it turned on and you do sales times 3, it's going to scan that supplemental low elevation angle 3 times instead of doing 0.5 like it typically does now. All right, PRF editing. This is a pretty important one. So you have 3 different options with PRF editing. Is you can do auto PRF elevation. This minimizes the range folding across the entire radar umbrella, which is nice. Typically, we don't want to see range unfolding. However, sometimes that range unfolding that does exist may exist in a storm of interest to you, and that's where auto PRF storm came in. And what it does, it minimizes range folding based on the top 3 SCIT identified storms. However, sometimes maybe those 3 aren't the ones that you are most interested in. You're interested in a different one. Down at the bottom of the PRF control window, you can actually choose just 1 storm to minimize range folding on. So there's those options. And then the last one here is the manual PRF. It minimizes range folding based on what you select PRF to be. And in 12 and VCP 32, you can actually sectorize what those manual PRFs are. And the other ones, you cannot. Also, manual PRF is only allowed in all the preset VCPs and VCP 32 and 35. One caveat is in 112, you can only edit in the batch cuts. You can't do it in the split cuts down low. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about with modifying VCPs is the velocity increment, or the VMI. And you can see there's 2 settings, 0.97 knots and 1.94 knots. 0.97 knots is recommended for most situations because it'll give you the best resolution of the velocity product. However, 1.94 knots does allow for a wider range of velocities, which is important if you're tracking a hurricane or a derecho, because you get the much stronger winds with those events. So we recommend doing 1.94 knots in those situations. All right, let's move over to RPS lists now. And the purpose of an RPS list is to allow for AWIPS to request products from an RPG or an SPG in an automated fashion. The first thing we'll look at is there are 2 types of RPS lists. There's the national RPS list, and then there's the local RPS lists. The national list just requests a subset of products from all radars that are then centrally collected that can then be sent out to all WFOs via the satellite broadcast network. It also archives that data at NCEI. These lists are nationally managed and should not be edited, or else downstream effects can happen. For the local RPS lists, these allow for local offices to customize their products. So maybe there's something on that you're needing that isn't on the national RPS list, they're viewable only by the local office. So if you request that product locally, you're only going to see it locally. It doesn't go out anywhere else. And then these files are locally managed. So we'll get into that a little bit too here in just a minute. So a little bit more on the national RPS list is, first, they are located on DX1 and DX2 inside this AWIPS2 RCM data config drop-ins directory. And like I said just before on the other slide, is do not edit these files because they are used for central collection and distributing to everyone else. There are two national lists for the RPGs, one for clear, one for storm. And then there is one for the SPGs. It just does a storm one for VCP 80 and 90. However, as you saw, I said DX1, DX2, not everyone has access to that computer on the AWIPS system. And so if you don't and you want to see these national lists, you can go to this VLab link down here at the bottom and just enter your LDAP or email credentials and you can take a look. All right, so let's jump over to local RPS lists now. And first off, you'll note that there are 3 different locations, and that seems kind of confusing at first, but hopefully after we discuss this, it'll make a little more sense to you. First off, there is the active directory. This is on DX1, DX2, and you can see that it is the same location as the national RPS lists. And then you have these draft backup directories, which are in your home cave data directory or in data FXA RPS list. These are accessible by all users, and this is where you will make edits to RPS lists and other things like that. Again, we'll get into that here in just a minute. So let's take a look at that active directory just a little bit more here for local lists. This active directory is where the radar server polls for local RPS lists with a matching current VCP. And then if it does find a matching VCP or doesn't find a matching VCP, then depending on whether you are the transmitting WFO, which is the WFO that sends data to central collection, or if you're not, then you have different behaviors. So if you are the transmitting WFO and there's a matching VCP, it'll merge the national RPS list with that local RPS list and then send that on to the RPG to get all the products at once. If there is no matching VCP, there's a default template file for each VCP. It'll merge that default template with the national RPS list and then send that over to the RPG. If you're not the transmitting WFO and there is a matching local RPS list, then it just sends that local RPS list. It doesn't do anything with the national list. And then if there is no matching local RPS list, then it takes that default template and just sends it. All right, so file naming convention is important for your local RPS lists, and this is for in that active directory. For the RPG, you can see here's the generic form, and then here's an example. The RPG does define separately for clear and storm mode. KNNN is replaced by your radar ICAO, and then you either type in storm or clear, depending on which one it is, and then you type in, for VCPXX, you just replace with the VCP number. So there for Paducah, we've got a storm mode and a VCP 12. For the SPG, it defines only for storm, and you basically just replace TNNN with the radar ICAO, and then for VCPXX, you just replace the VCP number. So for Las Vegas there, we see TLOS.storm.VCP90. All right, so you heard me say something about default files there, so let's just talk a little bit about that. Again, the location is inside that active directory on DX2. These template files are great to use as a starting point for creating new local RPS lists. That way you're not having to start from scratch. You can start from something that's already working, which is great. But also know that these are used when site-specific local RPS lists are unavailable, as I just mentioned a couple slides ago. The SPG does not have any template files, so just be aware of that. You'll need to have a local RPS list for them. And then here's some examples. They're also highlighted in the terminal window that you see there on the right. All right, so now let's move over to the draft backup locations. Again, those are in your cave data directory or in the data FXA RPS lists. This is a place where the user can develop RPS lists. You can edit these lists via the RPS list editor in AWIPS. So that's nice. You don't have to deal with the text file. You can do this through a good, simple GUI that has been developed by AWIPS. One thing to keep in mind, though, is changes made, saved, and sent from here are only used until AWIPS automatically sends an RPS list, which typically occurs when a VCP change happens. If you want your changes in these draft backup locations to be made permanent, just make sure you copy them over into the Active Directory. And again, you're going to need access to DX1, DX2, so you may need your local ITO or somebody like that that has access to be able to make those copies. All right, so how do you actually make and edit a local RPS list? So first thing you want to do is, again, copy the local RPS list from the Active Directory into one of those draft backup directories. Give it the .rps extension, because if you don't, the RPS list editor can't read it. And then change the template file name to have the proper naming convention for your intended radar. After that, make your edits via the RPS list editor. Save your changes. And then copy the edited file from the draft backup directory back onto the Active Directory on DX1, DX2. Just make sure you remove that .rps extension, or the radar server isn't going to read that file like it should. And then restart the radar server so that it sees that new edited file. For the RPS list editor, there are quite a bit of options here, and I won't go into detail in here, but this is basically now so that you don't have to spell out each product on each elevation angle in your RPS list. So your RPS list can be modified down a little bit, which is great. It also gives you the options to do sales and MRLE more efficiently instead of having to do a bunch of multiple entries. So that's what all these new request options are available for. And then the last thing we'll talk about here is limitations to your RPS list. If you have a dedicated or supplemental connection to a radar, you have a limit of 300 products requests. That's quite a bit, but now with sales and MRLE, you might be flirting with that 300 limits. Any product requests or count that goes greater than 300 here, those are truncated. So it's important to put your most important products first on the list. It'll just truncate, just go through that list from top to bottom, and when it hits 300, it says, okay, I'm not grabbing any more. For WAN dedicated or backup connections, your limit is 65 products or requests. So it's even more imperative that you limit products to low elevation base data and then maybe some algorithms. And then if you suspect truncation is happening, you can run this more command on your radar server log inside the Active Directory and just grep for truncated, and it'll tell you what is being truncated, if anything is being truncated. All right, that's all I've got here. So in summary, for VCP best practices, you want to choose a VCP which meets the meteorological need of your event, and then you could utilize AVSET, Sales, MRLE, Base Tilt, PRF Control, VMI to further tailor the VCP to your needs. And then for RPS list best practices, just know that you cannot edit the national list. These are responsible for central collection, but you can make local RPS lists, and those are allowed so that you can meet your local needs. But be aware of the count limit so that you're not putting most important ones down at the bottom. Make sure you're putting those towards the top. So if you do have truncation, you're not losing what you really want to have. And with that, just before I turn it over to Jill, I just want to first off say thanks to many people here at the ROC and at AWIPS for helping me put this together. This was not a one-man show by any means. And then here are some references that I used throughout making this that can help go into a little more detail if you'd like. So I will now turn it over to Jill for the Q&A. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Clark, for the presentation. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to you coming to our next sessions. So have a good day, everybody.